Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and as I'm sure you're all very well aware of at this point, Masters has come to a close. In fact, we're now barely outside of the second stage of Challengers starting, and so I wanted to get you all the information from Masters to sort of set expectations moving into those upcoming events. A little bit on the weird side though, Masters was a large number of incredibly high profile but very small events, few teams participating, in some scenarios just a single elimination bracket of best of threes up through to the final, so not a lot of samples to work with. Instead of doing the typical broad statistical summaries that I tend to do with larger scale events that just simply have more matches played, I wanted to instead take these Masters events and compare them internationally, pulling in a couple at once. So this video will be looking at North America, Europe, Korea, and Brazilian Masters all side by side. Let's jump right into it. Starting us off, I wanted to take a look at the map pick rates throughout all of these different events, and as I'm sure you can see, in a very different format than what we're used to. We have here a pie chart for each of the major Masters events that we're discussing in this video. If we start with Brazil, we see that there's a fairly pronounced concentration to their map selection. We see Haven coming in at over 31.5%, Bind with over a quarter as well, and the remainder really chopped up mostly evenly among the last three. You have both Ascent and Split carving out roughly 16% apiece, and the last 10 or so going to Icebox. If we drop down to North America in that bottom left-hand corner, it's the closest in terms of similarity to Brazil's pool, with Haven picking up an almost identical share of the pool and Bind not too far behind. When you get to that last section though is where NA's diverges pretty substantially from Brazil's. We see Ascent taking over a quarter, Icebox at just over 15%, and Split muscled almost entirely out of the pool at just over 6%. From there, if we go to EU in the bottom right hand corner, it's surprisingly similar to NA's setup. We see Ascent taking that over 25%, creeping up towards 30%. We see Icebox at around 15%, Bind at roughly 20%, and it's when we get to Haven and Split that EU diverges from NA in that Haven's play rate is halved, and all of that is directly allocated to Split. We have Haven going from roughly 30 down to 17 and change, and Split going from 6 up to north of 20. Lastly, that will land us on Korea, which is fairly similar to EU. We see that 30% in Ascent again, a roughly 15% on Icebox, a roughly 15% on Haven, and then in this case, it's Bind and Split that are the mix-ups. We see a 15% pick rate on Split, and a 25% roughly on Bind. Looking at these map pools in a little bit more concise terms, you can see how they were ranked top to bottom here for every single region. In Brazil's case, you have Haven coming in at the top, followed by Bind, a third, fourth place tie between Ascent and Split, and Icebox coming in the last. In Korea, you have Ascent first, then Bind, and then a three-way tie by the remaining maps. In NA, it's the only one where it is a clean linear drop down. Haven in first, Ascent in second, Bind in third, Icebox in fourth, and Split in fifth. And then last in EU, we have Ascent in first, Split in second, a third, fourth tie in Bind and Haven, and Icebox again in last. The reason I wanted to include this portrayal of these numbers in addition to the pie charts was if we average all of these rankings, we can get a rough idea of what a global map ranking might look like at this particular snapshot in time. And that snapshot would be Ascent as the most played, followed by Haven, then Bind, then Split, and then Icebox. A ranking that is, ironically, not held by any one region. The standout map of this bunch for me is Haven, where in both Brazil and North America, it's the top map. And then you look at Korea and EU, and it doesn't even find a place until third. But that's enough of maps, let's move over to agents. Again, we'll be looking at this in a way that is very abnormal to a typical computing competitive. Instead of just having top to bottom numbers, we'll have these clustered bar charts where the agent's pick rate in each region is stacked directly next to each other, and I'll be breaking down each of these individually as we go down the list because it's a lot to take in looking at this single chart. And another quick interjection, these agents are just listed in alphabetical order. There is no hierarchy here in terms of anything like their average pick rate. And that's because I really wanted to be honing in on the relative international relationships as opposed to where they stood in some sort of theoretical international set. If we kick it off with Breach, there's a really interesting parallel to the Haven point I just made. In both Brazil and NA, there's a very low play rate here. In Korea and EU, it is substantially more, a multiple at that. And you almost have to immediately start questioning, alright, we see that there's a very clear regional divide and it pars almost 1-to-1 with a regional map preference. The presumption behind this, at least the way I have looked at it, is there's a significantly lower pick rate of Breach in North America and Brazil because of how much they value Phoenix on maps like Haven. That map's fairly low-risk farmable orbs for each side, the C-long orb for attackers and the banana orb for defense, allows for a very easy cycling of Phoenix ultimate economy, and so the fact that Brazil and NA are prioritizing that on that map, and it represents such a significant amount of their pool, in a lot of senses will dismiss away the fact that their Breach play rate is so low. As a footnote here, the fact that Korea is still the most breachy region of the world is no surprise, Vision Strikers being one of the most predominant early pioneers of this pickup is very clearly still holding over. And that will bring us one more notch down the list to Brimstone, who's going to be the first agent on the list who actually saw a 0% play rate in more than one region. As a matter of fact, the only agent he shares this title with is Yoru. 0% in Brazil, 0% in North America, just over 11% in EU, and barely a scratch above 15% in Korea. This one is going to have a lot more of an abstract explanation behind it, but I'll distill it down to as simple a concept as I can, and flatly put, Brazil and North America are more focused on being explosive and aggressive. They like Omen paranoia too much to pick Brimstone. I think in Korea they're more broadly willing to put a high valuation on unique ability characteristics, so something like Brimstone Ultimate is always going to carry more weight for them, and in EU, Brimstone is seeing play because of how potent he's shown to be in a lot of the post-plant-centric compositions, like those we've seen from Fnatic and now Ascend. And I think that those things just really don't exist in other regions right now. I think in Brazil there's an appreciation for that ability similar to Korea, but their pace just isn't as easily compatible with it. And when we look at NA, I think it's actually a fairly compatible pick when you look at some teams' playstyles, but there just hasn't been a lot of innovation outside of standard archetypes where you would potentially start seeing something like a Brimstone in, again, like a post-plant-centric setup. This will move us down to Cypher, and Cypher's a bit of an oddball. We see that he's floating just around 50% pick rate in all regions except for Korea, where he doesn't even break 20. We'll see the reason for that very shortly, but I'm sure many of you could already guess what it is. And that will move us on to Jett. Jett is an incredibly interesting one on this list just because of the sheer variance in region-to-region pick rate. We see Brazil at over 75% pick, and at the other end of the spectrum, EU at 29%. And then you have Korea and NA seemingly bridging the gap between them, Korea at just shy of 70, and North America at over 57.5. Brazil's recent love of dive compositions makes their pick rate something that is far from surprising. In Korea, the fact that Jett is still played at an incredibly high percent as a holdover from Vision Striker's lasting influence on the region's meta, also not a surprise at all. In NA, Jett's pick rate receding a little bit down to the high 50s as opposed to the 70s where we've seen it in the past is a little bit of surprise by comparison. And believe it or not, I actually think that part of the reason it's dropped in such a way is because of just how low EU's pick rate is, and bear with me on this one. There was a pretty pronounced movement in Europe over the last month or so where many teams, and I mean many teams, were shifting over from primary Jett ops over to Raze. In terms of access to verticality and positional advantage when opping, Raze ticks many of the same boxes as Jett, albeit with slightly more risk. But at the same time, Raze also offers a far deeper pool of utility and EU's defaulty style absolutely adores that. The option of having either an earlier mid-round boombot to clear a particular pocket of space is something that they very clearly love, and the option to counter timing and explosive execute with a paint shell is always going to be an astronomically high estimated value ability use. While Jett has a lot of advantages in her own kit, obviously a very strong economic buffer in the Blade Storm, as well as an ability to take unreasonably aggressive angles that can't be parred by any other agent in the game, I think that many teams are coming to the conclusion that when it comes to consistency, Raze is just the better pick at this point in time. You'll always get some form of soft information off of a boombot, you'll get some form of zonal denial from a paint shell, but when we look at Jett by comparison, if she isn't finding frags, her kit is astronomically shallow and low value. If you're not in a region or playing a style where you can comfortably say to your Jett every round, either take a ludicrously aggressive angle or prep for this flash and dash play, then I think that's an underutilization of her kit, and frankly, Raze is just the better pick for your team 100% of the time. There is obviously that caveat though, and I think that's why we see such high sustained play rates in Brazil and Korea. In Brazil, their play pace is absolutely ridiculous. The percentage of rounds that are just going to be that explosive dive play or flash and dash setup is so high that picking Jett at this rate is completely rational. And in Korea, I mean, how many months at this point did they spend as the international gold standard in flash and dash play innovation? It being at this level doesn't surprise. But that's enough about Jett. Dropping one more down the list, we will land on Killjoy. And this is where the explanation for Korea's Cypher play rate comes in. We see Brazil, EU, and NA all between the 20 and 30% play rate marks, and then Korea at 50 even. Now, Korea could just have an odd, unique affinity for Killjoy, but I think part of this is that they have been playing Breach Jett Flash and Dash since beta. They are so used to, at this point, having their tripwires blown to smithereens by dashing Jetts that they have given up on the cause. If you look at regions like NA and EU, traditionally the Jetts were far more op-focused than they were dive-focused, so that transition wasn't as pronounced. And in Brazil, I think their holdover on Cypher is out of a very high valuation on spy cam, as well as an adjustment that they've made for deep sight kill trips in a lot of situations. This is going to be one of those ones on the list that will stick out to me, as I'm just going to be really interested in seeing how this dynamic evolves going forward, as we suddenly have teams like FaZe that are running a significantly more egregious divey style in NA. Maybe tripwires will go down in estimated value in most teams' perspectives, and we see a similar shift to that in Korea, or maybe you see an adjustment more to the way that Brazil is playing, where if they are continuing to run that Cypher, it's with deep sight kill trips as the primary form of use. And that will land us on Omen, who is frankly the most boring on this list by a landslide margin. 100% pick rate in NA, functionally 100% in Brazil, 85% in Korea, and 80% in EU. The only times that we don't see Omen as the primary pick is in regions who are willing to make that controller innovation, as we mentioned earlier when looking at Brimstone. Even post-nerfs, the aggro control binary style that Omen offers inside of a singular agent is just going to be way too appealing to too many teams to see his play rate drop significantly. I think this will change pretty noticeably when we have Astra cycling into major events, but in the meantime, Omen's still king. Rounding out the top half of the list, we have NA's poster boy in Phoenix, who surprisingly had a significant pick rate in another region. In NA, we obviously see him at 32%, far and away the most, but we also see him cresting towards 24% in Brazil. The explosive affinities of these regions, particularly on maps like Haven, as we discussed earlier, is going to be the primary driver of this. In Korea and EU, at just around 5% play rate each, we see that that is very much so still not the case, them having a preference for other flash options at a much higher priority. Next up, we have Raze, who had one of the higher average pick rates among the bunch. Where I've already discussed Raze's pick rates extensively earlier on, the one thing I want to highlight here is the relationship between these pick rates and Jett's pick rates. It's not the inverse that we would expect if these agents were being treated as direct alternatives. Instead, what we're starting to see is that there is a pretty significant global movement now towards Jett Raze double dive. The double dive setup is something that I've been talking up and highlighting since last November when China started bringing it out. So to see it starting to take a global grip is very encouraging to me in terms of the cues and development of compositional theory interregionally. Next, we'll move on to Reyna. Reyna is one of those ones that's hard to pin down, and I don't just mean in the game. Her pick rates here are pretty high variance, and there's a clear regional preference of who likes to run her. But there isn't a whole lot of consistency in how she's treated as an ultimatum to other flashers. You'll see a lot of teams that are opting for something like a Phoenix based off of a lot of very rational and macro strategy based decisions, and then you'll see teams in functionally identical situations say, no, we're going to run Reyna. And based on her kit at least, you have to imagine that that's due to a very high confidence in the potency of their duelists. But it's something that, again, there's really no rhyme or reason. It's just some teams that seemingly have more faith in their players' ability to frag, and so they're willing to take something like a Reyna that is a little bit higher risk over something like a Phoenix that has a more consistent and stable estimated value because of his ultimate. Next up, we have Sage, who continues her pattern of having a significantly higher play rate in Europe than anywhere else in the world. This is one that personally I expect to change pretty dramatically here moving forward, especially in North America. I think that coming into this next Challengers cycle, you'll have teams like 100 Thieves coming back with a renewed and better studied idea of how to implement this agent, and that will cause a shakeup in a couple of teams' perceptions of the metagame. Moving ever down the list, we land on Skye. Skye saw a fairly meaningful play rate in Korea, in no small part because Vision Striker's Stacks, someone who I've previously lauded as the best breach on the planet, has now been playing Skye on numerous maps. And I think there's been a little bit of metagame bleed from that into other Korean teams. We also see over in EU that Skye's prevalence in those mid-round post-plant-centric bind compositions from Ascend, Fnatic, and the likes also have been giving Skye a little bit of a boost in her presence. From there, we land on Sova, who continues to have an utterly ridiculous share of the market. And in a lot of ways, he's similar to Omen in just how much of a chokehold he has on his particular role silo. The key differentiator being that Omen has a direct alternative being introduced to the game very shortly, and Sova just doesn't. He's one of the few agents where, and I've said this before, you almost have to nerf him or introduce in the next agent something that directly counters him, because his prevalence and power in the game offers almost no opportunity cost to picking him. If you choose a Sova, you will almost never say to yourself, I wish I had something else in his slot. Down to Viper, we see that she's not doing much better than she has in the past. 2.5% in Brazil, 1.5% in Korea, nothing in NA, and EU at just around 18% buoyed heavily by Icebox and those bind compositions that have started running her. She is still struggling along, but buffs are en route, we know this, so we'll ride it out in the meantime. Rounding us out, we have Yoru, who is rounding us way out. Zeros across the board. That will wrap us up for agents, and moving into compositions, I wanted to do something a little bit different than usual. Instead of just giving you the top 5 comps from each of these regions, I instead wanted to elaborate on something that is a little bit of a hot topic recently, and that's the dynamic between single, double, and zero duelists. We've had situations where EU has long had a single duelist enabled by a breach, we've had NA that's always loved double duelist, and now we even have teams like Ninjas in Pajamas running no duelist. I wanted to touch on that dynamic and where a lot of people are talking about it, but there isn't a lot of concrete statistics or evidence to back up any strong opinions on it. I wanted to provide that as much as I could with current numbers. So let's look at it. The high-level overview here is that double duelist is pretty significantly the most prevalent configuration at 57.6%. It's followed by double duelist at 37%, no duelist at 4.2%, and triple duelist taking a very small cut at 1.3%. This in and of itself is a really cool chart to have access to, but I wanted to take it even further than this. This is a breakdown of what single duelist compositions look like. 61% of them are running Raze, 32% are running Jett, and 7% are running Reyna. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone really. Raze being the top most played here speaks to that EU preference that started to appear, where the region that has traditionally played the most single duelist and has moved from favoring Jett to favoring Raze now plays Raze the most when running single duelist. But wait, there's even more. We can cut this down even further in a way that I think is incredibly interesting. This is a carve out of how these single duelists are chosen in terms of their relation to flash initiators. So your breaches and your skies. Are they bringing a single duelist as part of a flash and dash configuration or completely cold? We can see that Raze single duelist is being coupled with a breach over a third of the time when it is that Raze pickup. And if we also add Raze Skye couplings to that mix, it's over 2/3 of all Raze single duelist games that we see. With Jett, it's even more dramatic, with breach pairings taking up more than half of her overall picks. And when combined with Skye as the other flash initiator coupling, it's near on 80% of her single duelist picks. Reyna's the only outlier here in that she is a true single duelist that is largely unsupported the majority of the time that she's seen as a single duelist. Before we move on, there's one thing that is also very worth noting here, and that's that Phoenix is nowhere to be found, neither is Yoru. If you are seeing a Phoenix, it's in Brazil or North America, and it is almost assuredly coming with a Jett or a Raze. And that will nicely transition us over to double duelist mixes, where we see that Jett Raze double dive accounts for almost half of all double duelist setups in the game right now. From there, it's a 3-way tie between Jett Phoenix, Jett Reyna, and Phoenix Raze. Ever so slightly behind those, we have Raze Reyna as the last significant pairing. The one interesting thing that I really want to highlight from this is that there's never an instance where there are two duelists that are both flashes. You have double dive, obviously no flashes involved, a dive with a flash, a dive with a flash, a dive with a flash, and a dive with a flash. There is no instance where we have something like a Phoenix Reyna pairing. And at first, I was stunned by that. I've long been a proponent that Reyna's flash is at its best when it's layered with another pop flash, so I thought this was some sort of glaring indictment of that read of mine on the way the agent should be played, but the more I thought about it, it's actually not that at all. What this is really telling us is that dive is too valuable to have right now, that you absolutely must bring it in one form or another if you are bringing double duelist. For those of you who've been following my Mastering Macro series on how I look at role dynamics, one of the things that I say is when comparing entries and dive agents, an entry's job is to push forward their team's map control, and a dive's agent is to get behind enemy lines and pull the map control forward. And so this dive flash dynamic where you have both that entry and that dive makes complete sense, because you're pinching extremely hard on the space you're trying to take, both pulling and pushing it forward at the same time and compressing it to a point where it's no longer sustainable. Before moving on, there's one last thing I wanted to touch on here, and again, it's that flash initiator inclusion. Instead of carving it out across each one of the sub-pairings of double duelists, I've just done a broad sweeping setup here so that it wasn't too convoluted. In terms of prevalence with double duelist, around 50% of the time it will be no flash initiator, around 40% of the time it will be with breach, and around 10% of the time it will be with Skye. A straight cut down the middle in terms of flash initiator or no flash initiator. Moving on to the last thing I'm going to be touching on in this video, it's going to be the top compositions from each region. I had to include them in some capacity, so we just have the top dogs from each here, the #1 comp from each region's masters. Starting at the top, we have Brazil, whose top comp is actually NA standard? Phoenix, Jett, Cypher, Omen, Sova. Brazil's fast-paced gameplay has evidently lent itself extremely well to the composition that has come to such prevalence in NA, predominantly spearheaded initially by teams like TSM. I was pretty surprised to see this at the top here. We know that Brazil has started running pretty extensive double dive. We know that in the past they've had an incredibly strong affinity for Raze Reyna setups, so for me to run the numbers and see that NA's top comp has made its way down south was pretty shocking. Moving to the next, we have Korea with Breach, Jett, Killjoy, Omen, Sova. This is one that's like the most Korean composition you could drum up. It is the classic Vision Strikers setup, with the one caveat being that new preference for Killjoy bumping out Cypher. Moving down to NA, who's surprised? It's NA standard. And moving down to EU, well, it's blank. But this is why. There was a 3-way tie for the most played composition in Europe. We see a consistent core of Raze, Cypher, Omen, but the remaining 2 pieces appear in a perfect recombination across these 3 setups, with Sage, Sova, and Breach appearing in each possible pairing. This is an incredibly cool dynamic to me because it shows just how preference-driven and map-specific EU's meta is right now. You have certain teams who are going to choose certain pairings of these 2 remaining slots depending on the map that they're playing and depending on just the players that they have on their roster, and it's not even remotely as clear-cut as you find anywhere else in the world right now. Alright, I'm going to close this out quickly because to cover this volume of information on 4 regions in even a remotely reasonable amount of time is quite literally impossible. So, if you're enjoying this content, don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.